what we're going to do now is discuss one more research paper, which also comes out of this broader research collaboration that we have with Facebook, but that goes back to using some of the Facebook microdata that Teresa's already described for some of the peer effects in product adoption paper. So the idea behind this paper is really to say that, look, one of the places, at least within the household finance space, where you might expect social networks to play a really important role is the housing market. So why do we think the housing market is important? Again, it's a very rare decision. Most people buy a house once or twice in their lifetime. So you wouldn't think that this is a decision where over time people build up so much experience that they don't need to ask for help anymore. But it's also a market where there's a lot of agents, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, etc. But when you interact with a real estate agent or you interact with a mortgage broker, you become acutely aware those are people who don't necessarily have your best interest at heart, but who might actually sort of have their own agendas, their own sort of things that they care about, and it's not really clear the extent to which any information you get through through mortgage brokers or these other agents, the extent to which this is useful, unbiased information, or the extent to which instead this might mislead you. And so the idea that these types of social dynamics might affect house prices, that idea isn't new, and in fact, Bob Shiller has been pushing this point for many years now. So when Bob Shiller was describing the 2006 housing bubble, the 2006-2008 housing bubble, what he said, look, people were excessively optimistic about housing investments, but then he said this optimism was part of a social epidemic. And it's actually interesting here is that this language from the epidemiology literature being used sort of pretty frequently by people that are trying to explain how through social interactions people update their beliefs, etc. So the idea is that I'm really optimistic. I think housing is a great investment, maybe because I've just made a lot of money in the housing market, and then I'll go and maybe I'll talk to Jordan, I'll talk to Teresa and say, look, you guys, we should all I just made so much money in the housing market. You should really look at this. It's a great investment, etc. And as a result, Jordan and Teresa become more optimistic. They start buying a house, etc. And so this type of, again, social epidemic, people infecting other people with their optimism is sort of a central part of the narrative about how peer effects can play a role for household financial decision making. But it's actually very hard to provide systematic empirical evidence for the underlying mechanism. To us, this seemed extremely plausible. In fact, I was in London in 2004. I was at a friend's house, and this was 2014. I was at a friend's house, and this was a period when the housing market was kind of booming in London, and my friends were all saying, look, we're making so much money, we're getting the foot on the property ladder, etc., etc., etc. And we were like, well, and I realized myself, I was like, oh, maybe I should start buying a house. And I was living in New York at the time, so what was happening in the London housing market had very, very little relevance to whatever decision I would be making about buying a house in New York. And yet I caught myself sort of realizing that I was getting caught up in these social dynamics, that once you hear these stories about other people making money, you get this fear of missing out. FOMO, people have described it as well, and you really want to jump in. And so a lot of narratives of bubbles across many markets, people have described Chinese equity markets over the past decade in sort of similar terms, seem to have this element of belief sort of spreading, optimism spreading across people, and sort of in the end affecting aggregate outcomes. But there's little systematic empirical evidence. And so this is where we come in this paper. So we think in this paper we can actually provide empirical evidence that this is really how things are going on. And here's the story that we want to tell. So the story that we want to tell is two parts. So the first part is I want to convince you that individuals actually discuss property investments with their friends and actually adjust their own expectations based on house price experiences within their social networks, right? So that's going to be the first part. So there's this anecdotal story that I experienced with myself, that this is one that seems to be sort of more broadly applicable to how other people in these markets form beliefs as well. And then in the second step, we want to convince you that by influencing expectations, social interactions have a large effect, not just on your beliefs, but it affects your beliefs enough to actually influence your decisions substantially. So it affects, your extensive margin decision. So people who have friends that have experienced recent house price increases are themselves not just more optimistic, but they're themselves more likely to buy a house if they were previously a renter. Conditional on buying a house, they're willing to buy a larger house. And conditional on the house they end up buying, they're actually willing to pay more for it. Right? So this is a story I want to convince you of, and like all empirical projects, I'll have to walk you through sort of lots of what we actually do in the data, but this is really the story that we want to tell. And again, it's one that I find very, very plausible, sort of upfront based on my own experience, but it was kind of fun to see this work in the data. So again, what are we going to do here? Empirically for measurement, we're again going to work, with data from Facebook. So we're going to have another snapshot of the social graph of Facebook friendship links. And, the average user in this data has about 420 friendship links. And as Teresa already mentioned, one of the advantages of working with Facebook data is that unlike almost all other social network data out there, say LinkedIn or Instagram or something like that, it really corresponds closely to sort of this set of personal friends, personal acquaintances that we have in our life. And then for each individual, we observe some information on their demographics and also county level location data. So here is sort of, kind of in a picture, sort of building up what we're going to do. So the first part of the story that we want to convince people of is that, your friends' house price experiences through social interactions affect your own beliefs about local housing market investments. And in order to do that, we need to measure two things. We need to measure your friends' house price experiences. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by combining information for each individual. We know who all of their friends are. We know where all of these friends live, and we know how aggregate house price movements in those parts of the country where you have friends, how they move. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then in order to measure the beliefs about the local housing markets, we're actually going to elicit those using a survey that was run on the Facebook newsfeed. So we're actually going to ask people, do you think that buying a house is a good or a bad investment? I'll show you the exact question we're asking in a little bit. And we want to show you in the first step of the paper that you do see evidence for this link. So I want to first spend a bit more time talking about sort of how to measure these friends' house price experiences. This is the object we're looking at. So we're going to be looking at the average house price increase in the counties where your friends live over the previous 24 months. There's nothing magical about 24 months here. You can do the same with 12 months or 36 months. I'm going to show you results today just on 24, but that's really not sort of essentially what's going on. And so when you have two people, now imagine they live in the same building, thought exercise. What can be driving these differences in individuals' house price experience? Well, the first part is where in the country they have friends. So these are, actually three different people I'm going to show you now, all of whom live in LA, but they have friends in very different parts of the US. So this is an individual here who lives in LA. So, everyone has a lot of LA-based friends, but this person, has another cluster of social links, somewhere in, I think, Pennsylvania. This is a second LA user who also has a lot of local friends in LA. I mean, if you live in LA, you're obviously going to have a lot of local friends there. But here, instead of having all these friends in Pennsylvania, this person has this large cluster of friendship links, in Minnesota. And here's a third person, again, living in LA, lots of local friends, and then this cluster of friendship links in Utah. So you can see that, amongst people living in the same geography, they share a bunch of local friends, but then where else in the country they have friends, and there's quite a lot of dispersion in it. This is driven by where they went to college and where they grew up, etc. What we're going to do is we're going to interact that, and so this just gives you some more summary statistics here. So again, you have about 420 total friends, but out of LA users, about 30% of US-based friends live outside of California, 25% live more than 500 miles away, and the average person has friends in about 55 unique counties. So that kind of gives you a sense that, these social networks, aren't, like, there's sufficient heterogeneity here that we can use to exploit this. What we're going to do is we're going to interact this with sort of, what the house price changes in those counties, those faraway counties, Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Utah, what house price changes in those places were over the previous 24 months. And that's the other element that we need in order to get any identification here. And so this kind of shows you a histogram, this specific graph, just picking a random 2-year period between 2013 and 2015, and gives you a sense about how dispersed house price movements are across different parts of the US. So over this 2-year horizon, in some parts of the US, house prices went up by 40%, while in other parts of the country, house prices went down by 10%. So it's going to be the interaction of where your friends live interacted with, how house price movements in that part of the country have moved. Now, one important thing is that we really want to measure the effect of friends' experiences through social interactions. One of the concerns that we have is, like in all of these maps, what you could see is that everybody has a chunk of friends that live locally nearby. Right? And so then the question is, what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we're not just picking up, people extrapolating from their own experiences when they forecast the future. And for those of you who've worked a little bit in the sort of belief space, there's a lot of evidence of this type of extrapolation, right? That when you forecast the future, you extrapolate from your own recent experience, and actually the next sort of sequence of presentations in 3 weeks from now is going to be about belief formation, etc. So we want to rule out that this is really about learning from friends rather than extrapolating your own experiences. And so what we're going to do is we're going to essentially instrument for the house price experiences of all your friends, really only exploiting variation in the house price experiences of your geographically distant friends. Okay, so you now have a sense on this left element how we measure the house price experiences of your geographically distant friends. And so now I want to convince you that through social interactions, those house price experiences have the ability to influence beliefs about local housing market investments. And so we measure those beliefs, as I said, using a survey on Facebook. So the survey was run in November 2015. And what we did is we targeted Facebook users through their news feeds, right? So when you log into your Facebook account, on the newsfeed, a survey would show up. We received about 1,200 responses to our survey. And one of the central things is we really focused the survey on targeting people living in a few LA zip codes. And part of the reason we wanted to target these few LA zip codes is because we wanted to ask people who were all sort of looking about the exact same local housing market. And so then trying to understand why there's disagreement. Why if I ask 2 different people and say, who live in the same zip code and say, what do you think, is going to happen to house prices in the zip code? Some people say, hey, they're going to go up. Some people say they're going to go down. We want to understand why do they disagree, right? In terms of the demographics, at least on observables, the people that respond to our survey look sort of representative to the overall population. So there were two different sort of sets of of questions that we looked at in this specific survey. So the first survey we asked was about how often do you talk to your friends about whether buying a house is a good investment? Right? So is this something that's sort of a regular topic of discussion among you and your friends? And what we see is that, yeah, some people say they never or rarely talk to their friends about whether buying a house is a good investment. But actually, the modal answer was people saying, yes, this is something I sometimes talk about. And actually a bunch of people, even say they talk about it often. So it's kind of the first thing, just convincing us that housing investments are actually regularly a topic of discussion within people's social networks. And then this is a second question, right? And we basically said, look, if you had a large sum of money that you wanted to invest, would you say that buying, a house in your zip code is either, a very bad investment or a very good investment? Now, the exact wording of the question here, we just took from, from other surveys. So we didn't, and the exact framing of the question, etc. So we just wanted to ask people, do you think that buying a house in your zip code where you live is a good or a bad investment? And here, what's important again is the fact that, all of these people that respond to the survey, they all actually live in sort of the same LA zip codes. And so, the fact that, some of them say it's a very bad investment, some say it's a very good investment is to some extent surprising because there's a lot of disagreement about the market. Part of what we want to understand is, to what extent we can explain that disagreement with sort of what parts of the country these different people, might be, might have their friends. And so that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to run a regression, and we're going to look at the survey expectation. Do you think it's a good or a bad investment? And we're going to regress that just very simply on the house price experiences of your friends over the previous 24 months. So what we do in column 1 and 2 is basically different versions of that. And what you find is that those people who've had higher house price appreciations in their social networks are also people who end up being more optimistic, right? Now, what we really want to do is we want to convince you and us that this is really because of those social interactions, not because of some other factor. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to look separately at the relationship between your own optimism and your friends' experiences. And we're going to look separately for those people who's who have primarily who say that they never talk to their friends about whether buying a house is a good investment, because for those people we shouldn't see an effect, right? If you never talk to your friends about whether buying a house is a good investment, this entire mechanism that we have in mind can't be operational. And in fact, you see for people that say they never or rarely talk to their friends about buying a house, you see no relationship between what's happening in the housing markets where their friends live and their own optimism. It's really only amongst the subset of people that say they sometimes or even often talk about whether buying a house is a good investment, where you see the relationship between what's going on where their friends live and the overall sort of optimism that they have about local house price experiences, about their own local housing market. So this is the first piece of evidence we have here, right? That really it is through social interactions, through these peer effects, through which the faraway house price experiences of your friends affect beliefs about local housing market investments. And what I said is that the second thing that we would ideally want to show is that through affecting your beliefs about local housing market investments, it actually shifts your actual investment behavior, right? So ideally, we would sort of maybe instrument for your own beliefs with the beliefs of your friends and then see what happens with your behavior. The problem with doing that is that we only have about 1,200 people in our survey. So it's a very small data set to then look at the actual housing market purchases. For example, if the baseline probability of buying a new house is very, very low, it's going to be very hard to look at these people. So what we're going to do in this paper here is we're going to look at the correlation between your friends' faraway house price experiences and your housing market investments. That is the advantage that we can now use this housing deeds data where we have hundreds of thousands of observations. This is a somewhat unusual research design in the sense, when we teach applied work, and when I teach this empirical household finance class, usually we spend a lot of time talking through some of the really, really nice research designs that people have come up with, instrumental variables, regression discontinuity, regression kink design, etc. And a lot of these sort of very clean research designs, you also see throughout this course, a lot of the papers, the last session had a bunch of them, today they'll have a bunch of them. But quite often what you find is you realize that, a question that you really want to go out and answer, doesn't have that nice of a research design. You don't have this sort of clean thing. And so what you have to do is do a research design that I call show a correlation and rule out all possible alternative channels. And that's not nearly as nice as clean as some of the sort of well-established causal identification strategies. And in particular, when you start out going down this road, you show a correlation and you start presenting. And then people in the audience will say, well, couldn't it also be this mechanism? Or couldn't it also be this mechanism? And for some of those mechanisms, you might have thought about it beforehand. But at least in the early days of presenting work, quite often, or every now and then, you hear something, you're like, well, okay, I don't know if any of the evidence that I have so far allows me to rule out that alternative. Right, and so then you go back and go back to your to your desk and talk to your co-authors and think, is there anything that we could do that would allow us to establish that it's the mechanism we have in mind rather than this alternative mechanism that explains what's going on. And then hopefully you find something and you present, and over time you kind of keep presenting, and that kind of allows you to to kind of build up sort of evidence. And at some point you've presented it enough and you haven't really heard a new story for a bunch of presentations, and you kind of are convinced yourself that you've ruled out everything else, and then you send it to a journal and you hope and pray that the referees don't come up with an alternative story that you haven't been able to rule out, and when they do, they either reject it or they give you a chance to address it in a revision. And I just see Florian has just posted in the chat, it's just to the panelists rather than to all the participants, but he says this empirical approach describes most of my own empirical work. And I kind of part of the point of telling the story, and I'm very glad Florian has the same sort of experience, is that we sometimes have this thinking that, like, unless we can sort of convincingly use one of these sort of well-established research designs, say IV or regression discontinuity, or you do a field experiment like some of the later papers do, we really can't establish causality, and as a result you just shouldn't touch the project. And my sense is the following. My sense is that quite often some of the most interesting questions, you have to go down this route. You have to go down this show correlation and rule out all other possible alternatives. It is a bit more hard work, and the types of presentations you give are a bit more messy. So I'm not going to do as much today as I would do in a seminar presentation. But basically, you're going to be spending a chunk of time kind of, in some sense, what it's like not positive presenting, where you put down your story, but sort of negative ruling out all other possible alternative stories. And that can be a little bit tedious. And again, you really hope that you've addressed them all by some point. But it is actually a relatively powerful research design, and it is being used quite commonly. So I would say don't despair if for the specific setting you have in mind you can't very effectively use the existing research design. This is something that can also work, and if you put in the effort to really go through all the other possible alternatives and rule them out, it can be as successful as if you have a clean IV or a clean regression discontinuity. So just a little bit of just background on that. As much as sort of we all like these very clean RD papers, like the one Neil Mahoney was presenting last week, or Chris Palmer, when you have that setup, that's obviously great, but you should not pursue a project just because you don't have that setup, in particular if you think the question you're after is sort of interesting and important. So just a little bit as an aside here. So I'm going to show you that next. I'm going to first show you the correlation, and then I'll sort of highlight a few other alternative stories that we rule out. And as I said, if you want to go through all the ones that we rule out, that's really what the paper is there for. For today's presentation, you just have to believe me that by the end of this long process of presenting and refereeing, etc., people didn't come up with any story that we didn't think we could rule out with some piece of evidence along the way. Okay, so let's look at some of the correlations. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at this individual housing market behavior. We're going to look at how that correlates with the friends' house price experiences over the previous 2 years. And again, our story is that the reason they correlate is because these house price experiences of your friends affect your own beliefs. And you in your mind will probably have a bunch of alternative stories right away of what else it could be. And then as we kind of, I'll walk you through some of them, and I'll explain why, why I don't think that, that all of them are, are plausible, right? So the regression we're going to run is, this is, a data set. You can imagine this as being 2 snapshots, of the LA population. The data is provided by a company called Axiom. And it basically tells you in 2010 and in 2012, it tells you whether someone was a renter or an owner. And so the regression we're going to run is we're going to regress, a dummy variable of whether the individual was an owner in 2012. And we're going to regress that on the house price movements of their friends, both between 2008 and 2010 and between 2010 and 2012. And we're going to run this regression separately for those people who already owned in 2010 and those people who were actually renters in 2010. So where, if they moved to owning, it would actually buying a house for the first time. We're going to just focus on LA County. We're going to have lots of controls in here. So we can control for changes in family size, income, marriage, occupation, etc. What we're also going to do is we're going to control for zip code pair fixed effect. So this is, an interaction of where did this person live in 2010 and where does this person live in 2012. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to rule out sort of preferences in whether or not you want to own or rent separately from preferences in where you want to live. right? So sometimes it is like if you want to move to a certain neighborhood, you can only buy a house in that neighborhood. There's no rental units available. And we want to sort of remove that from our analysis. So here's the regression. And so columns 1 and 2 basically show you the effect of friends' house price appreciation on the probability of owning in 2012 among those people who were renters in 2010. So the mean dependent variable is about 18%. So what does this mean? It means, out of those people in LA who rented in 2010, about 18 of them were homeowners by the time in 2012. Magnitude-wise, we find actually a pretty big effect. So a 5 percentage point increase in the house price appreciation in your social network between 2008 and 2010 is associated with a 3 percentage point higher probability of being a homeowner by the time you reach 2012. And so again, that's relative to a baseline probability of about 18%. So that's a very large increase. And it's about half the effect size of having a kid. So again, in our data, we also observe, whether someone's family grew. And this 3 percentage points increase is about half the effect size of adding a family member. So this is a very large effect. In column 3 and 4, we're looking at people who already owned a house in 2010. So here, if you look at the mean dependent variable, it's like 94%, 93, 94%. What does that mean? It means once you own a house, you basically, most likely, you will stay a homeowner throughout the rest of your, of your tenure. But even here we find an effect, about a third of the magnitude. But what it means is that even amongst owners, so here you want to flip the story now, even amongst owners, if you have friends who live in parts of the country where house prices have really collapsed over the previous few years, it makes you actually more likely to sell your house and become a renter, so to trade out of the housing market. Again, the effect size is about a third of that we observe for the rent to own transition, but it's quite amazing that even the own to rent transition is somewhat affected. And then what we want to do is we want to look at, conditional on buying. We want to look at the intensive margin. So do you buy a larger home when you buy and when your friends have had more positive house price experiences. And so we're going to run a regression that regresses, log property size on, on the friend experiences, over the previous 24 months. And what we're going to do is we're going to control for a lot of things like transaction quarter, buyer characteristics, etc. And so what we see is that, individuals who buy a new house, whose friends saw a larger house price increase over the previous 24 months, they're actually more likely to buy a bigger house. So again, the same 5 percentage point higher house price increase, leads you to buy about a 2% larger house in terms of square footage. And lastly, what we want to do is we want to look at the effect on price, on transaction prices. So this is a fairly standard, hedonic regression that you're looking at. So it's a log of the transaction price regressed on the friend's house price experiences, as well as, many, many characteristics of the property and the buyer that we observe. And here what you see is, again, that, people whose friends experienced a 5 percentage point larger house price increase over the previous 24 months, they are willing to pay about 2.3% higher transaction price, relative to other people. So that's a pretty large amount, right? So relative to the average sort of house price in this area, this could easily be sort of $10,000 more that you end up paying for a house. What we do in column 5 actually is we're going to include not just the house price experiences of the buyer of the property, but we're also going to include the house price experiences of the friends of the seller of the property. So why do we do that? Well, if you think about how house prices are determined, it's usually some sort of bargaining process between buyers and sellers, right? And if the buyer is more optimistic, and then house prices are going to be higher because their willingness to pay is higher. But if you think that there's some sort of Nash bargaining or some other bargaining protocol where the final transaction price ends up being somewhere in the middle of the valuation of the buyer and the seller, then if the seller thinks the house is valued higher, maybe because their friends tell them all about how much money they've made in the housing market, you might also expect that as a result, house prices end up being higher. And that's exactly what we find here. So both higher appreciation in the networks of the seller and higher appreciation in the networks of the buyer both lead to higher transaction prices. And again, that makes us sort of more confident that that what we're picking up really is, to do with these social interactions, and not some sort of competing story. So here is, so this is what I've shown you so far. So this has been the correlation part. So I've shown you that the house price experiences, in your social network affect these various aspects of your housing decisions. Do you buy a house? Conditional on buying, how large a house do you buy? And conditional on the size of the house, how much are you willing to pay for it? Again, now we want to argue that this beta coefficient is due to effect of social interactions on beliefs. And, we've shown some evidence that's consistent with that, in particular, that these types of social interactions do seem to affect beliefs. But we now need to rule out a lot of alternative stories. And the first alternative story that I think, it's sort of a first order thing that's in everyone's mind, is that the geographic distribution of the social network isn't random. Right, so said differently, people who have friends in Boston are very different to people who have friends in Miami. Now, what's interesting from our perspective is that this is sort of true. In fact, it's entirely true, right? So people who have friends in Boston are, just to give an example, more likely to have graduate degrees than people who have friends in Miami. But remember, our identification doesn't come uniquely from where in the country you have friends, but it comes from the fact that you interact where in the country you have friends with how house price movements in those parts of the country have been over the previous 24 months. So it's that interaction, and that's very, very powerful, because while it's true that people with friends in Boston are different to people with friends in Miami, in a given year, it's pretty random whether or not house prices in Boston outperform those in Miami, or whether house prices in Miami outperform those in Boston. And so what we can actually do is we can look at whether or not your friend's house price experience is correlated with any observable characteristics that we have, and the answer is no. And it's precisely because, yes, your network is correlated with observable characteristics, but the house price movements in your network are not. The other thing that we can do is, for some of the regressions, we can actually, look at within individual variation in friends' house price experience. So it's comparing the home purchases of the same person with the same friendship network in Boston. We're going to compare them across, 1 year where Boston house prices outperformed those in Miami, versus another year where Miami house prices outperformed those in Boston. And again, that identification gives us very, very similar results. Something else you would worry about is, something we've talked a lot about, and I think you'll see this every presentation throughout the rest of the day will have to address this. It will say, well, can we rule out that the effects we have are due to common shocks to individuals and her friends? And in some sense, Teresa kind of gave you very nicely this sort of framework of how you can think about dealing with this type of problem, right? And one of the ways you can deal with it is with random shocks to your network, and that's kind of the idea that we have in mind here. Yes, who your friends are is sort of random. It's not random, but the shocks they get, the house price movements where they live, are sort of random. And you'll see that, like Florian and Emily, for example, their presentations will focus on field experiments to get around this challenge. And Jordan's paper, for example, is going to focus on this randomly assigned peer group identification strategy that we've talked about as well. So you'll see different papers have different ways of dealing with this. Here we worry about this, and in particular, the thing that we worry about is in some sense, you'd say, again, if you think about common shocks, firstly, what you have to realize is that this measure here that we have on the right-hand side, this friend's house price experience, this does not depend on the behavior of your friends, right? So these friends' house price experience are independent of the behavior of your friends. And it's only what the aggregate housing market does where your friends are. So the one type of concern that we had along these lines was that what one could be picking up is sort of shocks to what we call geographically clustered professions. So here's the story we worried about. Imagine, you're a tech entrepreneur living in LA, right? And, tech entrepreneurs have a lot of friends in the Bay Area because tech is a big, it's a big industry in the Bay Area. And so now imagine that in a given year, there's a big positive shock to tech, right? So that means that this tech entrepreneur in LA has more money to buy a house. But it also means that all the other tech people, most of whom live in the Bay Area, also have more money to buy houses. And so this drives up housing demand in the Bay Area, and drives up aggregate house prices in those parts of the country where your friends live. right? And so you will see that, this person's faraway friends live in parts of the country with high house price experience. This person's more likely to buy a house, but it's not a result of the peer effect, the story that we tell, but it's because of this fact that, this person works, say, in an industry that is very geographically clustered, such that a positive shock to that industry can actually move aggregate house prices where those people live. So in this paper, we address this by, looking at individuals who work in professions that aren't so geographically clustered, say teachers. Right, so it's not the case that even even if it were the case that in a given year, say there's a positive shock to the teaching profession and they all get more money, that there's any part of the country where there's so many teachers that this was move aggregate house prices, where those teachers live. Let me just address one more thing that we worried about, which was bequest and wealth effect. So here's one story we worried about. We said, look, maybe some of this link about why, say, when you think about the example we had up front, why some people have more friends in Utah and other people have more friends in Minneapolis, is because that's where they grew up, right? And if that's where they grew up, maybe their parents still live there. And if their parents still live there, maybe their parents still own a home there, right? And so what could happen is that when house prices in Minneapolis go up, this person's parents now own a much more expensive house, and therefore, they're more able to, say, help them with a down payment, or, the person feels richer because they think they'll inherit a more expensive house at some point. And it's those bequest effects that make them more likely to buy a house themselves. And again, we have a bunch of ways in the data to rule this out. So for example, one thing we can do is we can sort of look at subsets of your network. So we can restrict just to people that aren't your family friends, say your college friends or your work colleagues. And you wouldn't expect to inherit a home from your work colleagues or your work friends, and still we find very similar effects. So as you can see, there's lots of other alternative stories that in principle could explain the correlation we have, and the paper goes into a lot more detail into ruling them all out. I just want to give you a flavor of sort of the, again, this type of research design, which which is actually pretty common. But which sometimes people look down on a little bit because it's not quite as pretty as some of these RD graphs that you can show, or it's not quite as clean as a field experiment that you can run. But actually, it can be quite powerful. But you do have to go through this process of ruling out all the competing hypotheses. Is this type of behavior rational? We spend a lot of time going back and forth about how much we should push this. So is it rational that when your friends live in part of the country where house prices have gone up, that you yourself become more optimistic? Is there any useful information, in the behavior of your friends? And kind of for the paper as we wrote it, we kind of punted on that story. We punted a little bit because, you don't, from a pure strategic perspective, you don't have to pick every fight that kind of, like when you say it's not rational, that very quickly annoys a large fraction of possible referees. And if it's not really core to the message of the paper, sometimes it's just worth saying, look, it's kind of hard to say, with conclusively. And so I think, this is the language we settled on in the end. So we said, look, it's hard to rule out fully rational expectation, but there's a lot of pieces of evidence in the data that make us question whether or not this type of behavior is rational. So the first thing is that the effect is weakly declining in education level. So you find that the least educated people are most affected by the house price experiences of their friends. The second one, and I think this is sort of the most, one of the most convincing for us, is that the effect is actually independent of the true informativeness of the house price experiences for future LA house prices. And this is just at least from a sort of historical perspective. So what do we do is we say, well, look, some people some people living in LA have friends in the Bay Area, and statistically in the past, Bay Area house prices have been a good leading indicator of of LA house prices. So after Bay Area goes up, a few months later, LA goes up. But you have other people whose friends mainly live in Nebraska. And Nebraska house prices are completely uncorrelated with LA house prices. Yet we find that individuals with friends in LA, with friends in Nebraska, are equally likely to adjust their behavior relative to individuals with friends in the Bay Area. So again, that speaks against some sort of rational story. And lastly, and I think to me, honestly, this is the most convincing story. It's also the most hand-wavy, but I think it's the most convincing, which is the following. Look, if it were truly that informative about, LA housing markets, say what's going on in the Bay Area or what's going on in Chicago housing markets, that it would affect your valuation of a property by tens of thousands of dollars, right? There's many, many other ways beyond having friends in these areas that you can get that information. You can go on Zillow in real time and learn about what's going on in the Bay Area if this was truly such valuable and useful information. And so the fact that it really comes through the friends and that people aren't going out of your way means that it makes it very hard to reconcile with a rational story. So what's the story? Again, I just want to recap the story that I hope to have convinced you of, is that really individuals do discuss property investments with their friends, and they do adjust their expectations based on the house price experiences within their social networks. And that through influencing expectations, social interactions have a large effect on individual level housing investment decisions, right? Both the intensive and the extensive margin, as well as the willingness to pay. So coming back to the start, to this, this Bob Schiller quote that he's actually been pushing since 1984. So he's a Brookings paper, 1984 Brookings paper, where he tells that very same story, not about the housing market, but about the stock market. So he's been sort of convinced that these types of social dynamics, the epidemiological spread like a disease of optimism through the population, is really at the heart of understanding, asset price movements, and in particular the formation of asset price bubbles. What's kind of nice for that story is that almost 20 years, actually only 30 years after he first wrote down that story, this sort of combination of the Facebook data with the survey and the housing transaction data puts us in a position to test the story. And it turns out that he was right all along, that the story that he's been using to explain US housing markets, say over the last decade, that there really seems to be strong empirical evidence for that story. There's also papers, actually sort of at the same time as we were writing this paper, Marty Eichenbaum, Sergio Rubello and Craig Burnside wrote this paper of looking at a model of housing markets and essentially taking this very same approach where beliefs weren't formed through some sort of Bayesian updating or rational process or something like that, but where beliefs were really part of this, this sort of, in fact, they borrowed modeling devices from epidemiology, right? The idea was exactly this, that you have optimists and pessimists, and and when an optimist meets a pessimist, depending on the strength of their priors, the optimist infects the pessimist, and so on. And sort of this Burnside Eichenbaum Rubello paper nicely shows how those individual effects can then aggregate up and can lead to large swings in house prices over time, right? So the modeling literature has taken some of this of these insights. But I actually think if I would just want to close on with this thought, if I think where this sort of, peer effects literature, where I hope this peer effect literature ends up going is, as we kind of accumulate more and more evidence that these types of peer effects, matter for lots of outcomes we care about: buying a house, trade, stock market investments, patent citations, all this stuff, that our modeling approaches will also adjust. Because in almost all models we write down, individual decisions happen in this kind of social vacuum, right? And that the only way through which, your decisions and your behavior and your beliefs affect that of other people is through a price mechanism. And this paper and all the other papers we'll see today show that there's many other ways beyond price mechanisms where your decisions affect those of others, and not just they affect them, but they affect them in quantitatively large and important ways. And our hope is that as we kind of jointly work on accumulating more and more evidence that these effects aren't just there, that they aren't just well identified, but that they're also large, it becomes harder over time for the theory literature to ignore those dynamics and to ignore those patterns, and that that then becomes a motivation for more theoretically inclined research to kind of follow the Eichenbaum, Burnside, Rubello logic and say, hey, maybe if we really want to understand housing market dynamics, maybe we want to move away from the purely rational framework and start modeling some of these belief dynamics, which might not be rational, and so that, to some parts of economics, now you're getting into the heresy region, but But actually, we should describe the world the way it is, not the world the way we think it is. And as more and more evidence accumulates that this really is an important feature in the real world, that we should also start modeling it more seriously. And so that's really our hope. But that seems to be, sort of the next step and the next dimensioning. And there's a few efforts like the Burnside-Eichenbaum-Rebello paper, which I'm a huge fan of. But I think there's scope for a lot more. So if some of you are, are more theoretically inclined, I think there's huge opportunities there to say, look, the evidence is accumulating. You can't ignore this anymore. It's quantitatively important. Let's now start and try and incorporate it into our equilibrium modeling. Right? Okay, so that's it from me. I think this is a topic I'd actually want to hear, like, all the other presenters' views on as well. So I think this is a topic we'll definitely come back to, in the panel discussion at the end, because I think, where do we go from here? Once we've, accumulated this empirical evidence, where do we go? Do we want to focus on more empirical evidence? And how do we make our empirical evidence useful for the model building part of the profession? I think I'd love to hear everyone else's views on, so we'll talk more about that then.